Hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of Reset Now podcast. Everyone talks about debt. Sri Lanka is in a debt restructuring process. People are also having a difficult time without being able to pay their debt, and there have been moratoriums announced during the time of COVID. So everyone talks about debt. So we got an expert from Sri Lanka, but now living in the UK, but have extensive experience working with IMF and with debt restructuring experience in some countries in Africa, Dr. Sangarabalan. Dr. Sanga, welcome to our podcast. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to Paradise.
Good to have you. Just first wanted to understand on Sri Lanka, as we all know, going through this process, but we really don't know what debt sustainability means. Some people say, don't take debt, we have to save money and
Mm.
do things. And even if we take debt, what is like the threshold, whether it differs from country to country, from economy to economy? I first would like to know with your experience, what is debt sustainability and probably how can Sri Lanka become sustainable in debt?
Okay, so in simple terms, debt sustainability means that how much of debt can you take? Okay, so how much of debt burden can you take? So there are two questions about how much debt you can take. One is the amount of debt stock that you can take, and that affects your credibility because you don't have to pay it that time.
Hmm.
So when you say I have a debt of 80% of GDP, it doesn't really mean you have to pay that now, right? But it signifies something about your credibility of paying in the future. So all the rating agencies will look at that number to say, is this a creditworthy nation? The second one is affordability. Okay, so that's where you come across the debt service payments due, and you have to pay that, and so on. So so these two are combined together in assessing how much is too much debt.
Hmm.
So that's the calculation that you do in order to say, whether the debt is sustainable or not.
Okay, so that also answers, or you can clarify it a little bit, because there are arguments being made. Okay, let's look at, okay, Sri Lanka's debt to GDP ratio is, let's say, 120%,
Mm.
but Japan, it's probably 200%. But if Japan can take 200%, why can't Sri Lanka take more than that? So in terms of your two main parameters you mentioned on credibility and how much debt is too much debt, how do you explain this context on your framework?
Yeah. So when debt sustainability started in technical terms,
Hmm.
there were two different approaches. One was based on the flow method, which is usually the budget. You look at the budget, whether you can afford through the budget or not. But in other countries, advanced countries, the assessment is made on net debt. So if you have enough assets with you, so they look at the gross debt minus the assets, and work out the credibility from that angle.
Hmm.
And then so the second point is that the yen is a reserve currency and rupee is not. Okay, so therefore,
Unfortunately.
yeah, unfortunately. So therefore, so because the first one, as I said, it's a credibility question.
Hmm.
How does so Japan has 200% is kind of maybe acceptable to some people, whereas in a poor country it's not acceptable. So that is why. And also I said this, whether you want to look at the asset liability situation,
Yeah.
assessed that way, or whether you want to look at the flow method, which is the kind of budget approach, basically.
Got it.
Okay.
Now, Dr. Sangha, there's so many reforms being discussed also to address this issue. Now we know we borrowed, as you said, too much money. We couldn't pay. Now we defaulted, and now in a big process of restructuring. And one suggestion that has come out is setting up a independent debt office.
Mhm.
Or so far it has been managed by the finance ministry, some through the central bank. Actually, people are
Mm.
quite not sure how actually this manages, and even There were so many debt numbers being thrown out. This is our debt, this is domestic debt, this is external debt, and Sri Lanka development bonds, that is a local debt, but it's in dollar terms. So there are so many technical terms
Yeah.
being, so how do you set up a debt office, or is that the right way to address this problem?
Okay. So, so first of all, let me say that everyone borrows. Okay, we borrow to get a mortgage or something to buy a house. So the nation also borrows, and the way that the Bretton Woods set up, at least the World Bank was set up after the war in when the war damaged Germany and the war in Japan, as you know. So they were damaged. So they had to give some money to develop those countries. So in other words, basically, you're given the money to develop something. So therefore, with the development, you are supposed to receive something from those projects. But if your Hambantota port is not giving you any money, if your roads are not, you know, the toll charges are not giving you money, or the taxation is not giving you enough money to pay, that is a problem of assessment. It's not a question of you did borrow, because you would have had a cost benefit analysis done, and that would have shown you that this debt is payable if you did it properly, right?
Yeah.
So the proper stream of income that you would have been generated was not generated, and that is why you have this problem. So the other question that you asked is
Was like setting up a
setting up a debt
debt
office.
office.
Yeah,
Is it the right thing? And
yeah.
if so, how are you
Yeah,
going to
I
set it
think
up?
I think most people think that the government interferes too much with borrowing, right? Because the debt managers are supposed to, just like independent monetary policy or independent debt policy, and that has resulted to whether to have a separate office, right? What's called the debt management office. Now, the advanced countries have moved in that direction because they wanted to separate fiscal policy, debt policy, and monetary policy. Otherwise, it all gets confused a bit. So that is why the advanced countries done. But what have done is to set up these things. But there's no. I don't think there is any country that has got an independent debt office. So there's a kind of little bit of independence given to them. So what we call as quasi independent debt offices.
Quasi independent debt office.
Debt
Okay.
offices. So if you look at the first debt office set up in 1789 by Sweden, that time it was set up because most of the kings that time fought wars by taxation. So
Hmm.
if certain amount of crop, if a farmer grows, they said, I'll take 20% off and sell it and get money to fight a war.
Right.
But Sweden said, okay, that is part of it, but we'll also borrow money.
Right.
Okay, so that's how they set up this debt Swedish National Debt Office in 1789. So it's the oldest debt office in the world.
Right.
And then there are variations of what we want to do the debt office. So New Zealand debt office in my country, the DMO UK was set up in 1995, quite recently, because we had this confusion between monetary policy, debt policy, and so on, and then there was no independent borrowing policy. Now, whether it's a good thing or bad thing depends on number of factors.
Hmm.
If you set it up in an advanced country, then you can actually recruit people, enough people to manage that, the right people to manage debt.
Hmm.
But if you do not have, in like I worked in a lot of the African countries, they don't have enough staff joining the ministry of, by the way, the debt office is really answerable to some extent to the Ministry of Finance, or
Hmm.
at least the Minister of Finance.
Hmm.
So even if it's quasi, it's sort of it's answerable, but they can form their policy of borrowing
Right.
when they are quasi independent. So when they start these things, you've got to have the right people to manage and so on. So this is the problem in advanced countries, because nobody wants to join the Ministry of Finance, but they're quite happy to join the central bank
Hmm.
because the salaries are better, right? So what they did in the advanced countries is to make the salary structure somewhere close to the central bank. So
Right.
they were able to recruit, because you need very talented people to manage debt.
Mm.
So so that problem wasn't there in the West. Whereas here, or in low-income countries, this is the problem, because they will learn something and they will leave and join the central bank or whatever, right? So one is the capacity, with the right capacity to recruit. Um, and then then there are, of course, in low-income countries, there's much more interference by the minister. You know, in the advanced countries, if the minister interferes too much, the prime minister will sack him. So that strength is there.
Mm-hmm.
So all put together, whether it's good or not depends on these factors. you know
Right.
and thirdly, even in most countries in Africa, where Kenya and Nigeria has some sort of quasi independent debt office, some part of the borrowing is left to the central bank.
Right.
Okay, because basically, if you trying to sell domestic debt instruments, the treasury bills, treasury notes, and the treasury bonds, then who are the buyers, right? Who are the investors? Mainly banks, insurance companies for medium-term uh, maturity bonds, the 5-year bonds, and the 15, 20-year bonds to be bought by pension funds. Because they have a natural role of supervision of these financial institutions, and they know who will buy when you put something out, in an auction. So this is what tempted, many of the countries to leave domestic debt management and do the auctions, all that to the central bank, as a, they call it the fiscal agent. So that part was left, and the other parts are the ones that they are managing. Okay, the external debt and so on. So I'm not sure I can give you a unique answer to this, because which one suits
Is
me.
better.
It depends on what you. But I think independent is better. But whether we can operationally do it that way or not, because of the staff capacity and so on, that's the problem that we have to sort out.
Dr. Sangha, so when you say independent, and let's imagine like the job role of the debt office, whether it's like independent or quasi independent. So what do they do day to day? Like imagine a World Bank comes, if there's a World Bank fund and we are going to borrow, and in an ideal case, they will do a feasibility study. So is that also comes under the debt
Yeah,
management office? What,
yeah.
what is the role by
Yeah,
then?
so both in cases of where there's a quasi-independent or even a debt department within the Ministry of Finance, all of them are today, I think I would say majority of them are set up in an arrangement similar to the corporate world, the front office, middle office, back office.
Mm-hmm.
And all these the three different departments, or the three different sections of the Department of Debt, um, they have different roles, their responsibilities are. So the front office, what it does is they do two things, basically: mobilization of external loans and issuance of securities in the local. But I mean, the issuance, operationally issuance is not done by them.
Right.
They allow the central bank
Central
to
bank group. So
do it.
basically, as usual, the central bank will issue, they do their bond auctions on
Yeah,
treasury
right,
bills, but okay,
right.
understood.
So what they do is basically, uh, allow them to do. But you see, central bank also can do lots of things to suit them. So they have to have a hold on what auctions,
Right,
how auctions are done, what's the maximum limit, and so on.
right,
So they sit in that committee to decide what's the optimum level of the,
right,
should be the. So where's the cutoff point? When you have the auctions, you have to cut off at some point, because many people will be bidding, right? So at the right price and the right quantity, you cut off. So I think for that reason they take a role, and then of course they bring the data and put it into the data set in order to do the reports,
right,
right? Because in the total debt you have to sum up the external and the domestic. So that role they will do, but the data itself is not. I mean, just bring the data, but they get involved partially with the central bank. On the external debt, the negotiations, right? So the starting point of a World Bank debt or loan is usually on a country assistance strategy, what they call the CAS. So they will come and discuss with the government, next year we are planning to have this country assistance strategy. We are only interested in the environment, roads, and something else. These are the areas, and but for the rest, the government will go now somebody else, right? So when they say that, once they agree to that, then the starting point the
Right.
starting point commences. So basically, they have to have a loan agreement, right, set up. Then we have to, because the World Bank have to be, that loan has to be approved by the board. Our side, the minister has to approve it with the approval of the Auditor General, because there's a legal terms inside the loan agreement, right? So all that has to be agreed, and so that part of the work of loan mobilization, negotiation, the front office does. So this is the role of the, mobilizing, external loans and that sort of area is the front office. In the front office of the domestic debt, as I said, they take a role. In the middle office is where all the analysis is done.
Mhm.
So if they want a debt strategy, they are the people, the lead people. And then, so that's a part, the analytical part of analyzing, drawing yield curves and all this kind of stuff takes place. And the back office is the recording. They basically record the loans, and when due, when some payment is due, then they have to process it. So basically, they write to the accountant general and say, can you process this payment?
Right.
And the accountant general write to the central bank to pay, because the accounts are kept in the central bank,
Mhm.
the government accounts. So they said, take it off from this whatever number, this account, and pay them off or something. So these are the three distinct
Means
roles. But it's not that the person in the back office, uh, he should not get involved with the front
front
office
office work.
activities, but he should know what is going on. So
Right.
what they have is, every month, say if you take the UK, they'll have coordinating meetings. This is what we are planning, and so on and so forth, and so on. And the last piece of work that the back office has to do is what we call operational risk minimization. So that means, if you keep a record of something, you've got to get duplicates and keep it in a safe place, and
Right.
so on. Otherwise, if a tsunami comes and runs over all, takes over
Yeah.
all the files, it's a difficult starting process again to restart and say, who are the creditors who gave us money,
Right.
and so on. And so basically, that part, the data management
Inside.
side, payment side, all this in the back office. So usually the back office is where the strength is. The most of the time, the number of people working the back office is much more.
Right.
You know, the front office number two, and the analysis is, I mean, they are the sort of in my culture, we call them they try to think that they're Brahmins,
Right.
right? We won't touch data and something. When you gives us, we'll do econometrics or something analysis.
Right.
So they always think they're superior, but they're not superior as such, basically. But I mean, they do some complicated work. But what happened when I was in Nigeria, because I was an advisor there, World Bank advisor. I was put into the middle office to train them all these quantitative stuff. And I saw most of the time, they will do, get involved in a DSA or a MTDS, medium term debt strategy calculation or something. And the rest of the time, they are reading newspapers, because they don't have any work. So this, if these things have to be produced, once a month, once a year, right? So what do you do with them? Whereas in the back office, every day you will have some payments due. So some loan has been signed and agreed on,
Hmm.
things like
Right.
that. So day-to-day operations are more in the front office and the back office.
Right.
Whereas the middle office, only now and then they get this analysis to be done.
Right.
You know, so it's a difficult task to get them fully employed in the middle
Office.
office. Yeah,
Understood.
because they don't want to do anything else, right? If it's
Yeah.
not quantitative analysis, they want to. And then that doesn't come very often. So that's the reason why, you got to be careful of, sort of recruiting staff, and you did recruit the right staff. So you put heavy emphasis on the back office, because this is due to, this is because of payments and record keeping and so on. but they are the most lowly treated, belong to
Right.
the lowest caste,
Right.
right? Because everybody thinks these guys are only
Keeping the records
yeah,
and
keeping the
making the
records, yeah,
payments,
but
and
but they are very important,
because if
because
you, yeah,
that's where when it goes wrong, it really goes wrong.
understood.
And the front office is because they have the capacity or the ability to go and mobilize loans. So that's also a talent,
Right.
so
It's
every
like very
time.
much a sales job, not a sales job, but
Yeah,
you go and
yeah. So when you get, suppose you are building a road, and there are two donors, right? Let's take, for instance, China, right? And then there's the European Union.
Hmm.
So you have to assess the loans.
Right.
So that capability has to be built up
In the
in the
front
front
office.
office. Yeah, there's a lot of calculation. Uh, I know some of your presidents have gone for the gone to the Chinese without the analysis, but I don't want to mention them. But you have to always do the loan
Loan
evaluation
evaluation.
when you get more than one. Of course, when you're a beggar and there's only one loan, you take it, isn't
Yes.
it? So that's what happens in countries where uh, there aren't many loans for the same project.
Dr. Sangha, now just a quick interruption. Now, would it solve a problem like Sri Lanka's problem? I understand the composition of the debt office, which I will go in detail. Now, imagine if I am a minister and I come and say I want to build a road. So, is the front office or the mid office evaluates whether the feasibility of my project, because whether which is because I can come, because I met a treasury secretary, and the way that they explained how the budget's being made, there's these ministers coming and saying, okay, I want to build that swimming pool, I want to build that playground, and everything puts into one table, and then you are thinking how to raise money,
Yeah.
and then it goes to the debt office. So whether debt office evaluates the feasibility, or is it someone else's job? How does it
I think
happen?
initially the project, it depends on depending on the project. If it's a
Hmm.
road project, then you probably have the ministry for that, Ministry of Transport or
Hmm.
something, right? So initially it starts there.
Hmm.
These are the roads to be built in the next 5 years in
Right.
Sri Lanka, and then we have to find some funding, right, to build the roads. So it's part of this policy.
Right.
Whereas the ministers tend to be like, if somebody is giving us some road that we are not prioritize,
Hmm.
right, to build between, I don't know, Trincomalee and some corner, right? Because they want to show evidence of something is being done, right? Because they can be re-elected. So this is where that happens, where a plethora of
Right.
you know project proposals all lying on the
Okay.
table, because that's where the minister has to be. Usually the minister in most African countries
Hmm.
is the most qualified person.
Right. Even in
Unfortunately,
Africa, we
oh,
generally we see, yeah.
Even if Africa, I mean, the most of the countries, I mean, even Sierra Leone, right? You have to have a PhD most of the time, but otherwise, because the last three, ministers of finance had PhDs, and they worked for the World Bank for about 10, 15 years as executive directors. So they know a lot. Okay, so when that person come, but then if the president pressurizes him to say, let's show some roads somewhere there, then we can get the votes, right?
Right.
So then he is overwhelmed by this other agenda,
I
right?
understand.
So I think that's why it gets a bit tough in the
Tough. Right.
in the. But normally, lot of the ministers of finance in Africa are very highly qualified, so that they can negotiate on IMF loan, because they were, some of them have actually worked in the IMF, so they know when the IMF comes, either Article 4 or some extended fund facility, that you're negotiating. So it's usually they sit down and talk like technicians, basically.
Okay.
And sometimes the Minister of Finance is more qualified than the permanent secretary in
Okay.
some countries,
Right.
because they put this man in front because they think that they can get a lot of money, right? Because
Mm.
when you show this man's CV, all the lenders will think, oh, this is a credible guy, right? So we can afford to give the money.
Just a additional question. Since you have extensive experience working in Africa, now general perception or generally how it's being quoted in media is, okay, Africa, their governance structures are poor. Probably it is pretty much they compared with Sri Lanka. Okay, you have unqualified ministers, unqualified secretaries. So that's probably the genesis of this governance issue that they have brought out. So if according to from what I just heard is in Africa, if they are so well qualified, do you I mean, of course we still know the per capita GDP and comparatively they are
much lower.
much lower. So what why is that? I mean, if they are well qualified and if they can negotiate, why the, if I may ask, why those countries are progressing? Or is it, do you see the indications, because we have also heard some good news from Ethiopia and some other
Mm.
countries in Africa? Is it the reason, or do you see a different reason, or do you see though the ministers are qualified, there are some other reasons
Yeah.
which is holding them back?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. Other reasons are holding them back because the president is an executive power.
Hmm.
I think you have the same kind of power.
Yes,
I think
yes.
here. So when Africa, because they were all most of them English speaking ones were under the British. Uh, so they like to keep the parliamentary system, but they have like the presidential thing of the U.S.
Right.
Right? So they want
Both.
they want both,
Both.
right? So, to have the cake and eat it. So so this the problem with Africa. Then secondly, supposing you put forward an investment strategy, there must be enough entrepreneurs taking on the strategy and taking those risks that are involved and all that. So that doesn't happen either because unfortunately, the amount of people that can do entrepreneurial kind of work is limited. Then the other side is basically they undergo all these environmental impacts. They have uh, sort of long term serious droughts, or if it rains, it pours like hell, right? So there are always floods and all that, and the education system and the health system is weak, so that you cannot build a capacity with that. Now that's the advantage in Sri Lanka. When I was growing up, there was free education. I mean, although I went to a private school slightly, but everything was available. The medical facilities were fairly good and free, right? So so all that is required. Just because a finance minister is a qualified person doesn't mean everything falls into place. So that's the reason why you know these countries like that. But like you said, like Ethiopia, Tanzania have done some, good work for a while. Then comes the drought and kills the agricultural sector. Then
Okay.
comes something else,
Hmm.
Ebola
Hmm.
or COVID or something, right? They can cause some disturbances. So these countries were growing after the debt relief they got under the heavily indebted poor countries, APICs. They were growing fast. I mean, 6%, 4%. The only country that I know and I worked, I would say it's well managed and sustained for a long time is Botswana.
Botswana.
Yeah, Botswana, because it has a per capita income of $8,200 per capita. But, so they had the resources, diamonds, but they managed it well. Now Sierra Leone has every mineral you can think of. They have gold, they have diamonds, they have ilmenites, they have bauxite, all this, but they're badly managed because they can't even get a contract with the producer.
Hmm.
Somebody has to come from abroad, right? So because they don't have the skills. So but they, obviously when you when the outsider knows that they can maximize their profits, they're going to give a little.
Hmm.
And of course the Sierra Leoneans will say, well, that's not enough.
Hmm.
Then the whole thing
They
breaks
won't.
down, so it's
Right.
not developed. So it's there are many things attached to economic development.
I want to come back to the debt office.
Okay, all right.
Now, I'm just trying to figure out finding a solution for, in the process of finding a solution for Sri Lanka's this problem. Okay. Now, from what I understood was, so basically, debt office is not deciding which project to pick up for sure. So I understand if it's roads, okay, the road development authority or that department has to prioritize which road to be built first.
Mm,
But the question would be, if it's roads, they can probably prioritize. But if it's a decision choice between a road and, let's say, a university,
mm.
for that instance, a public university, or so, then who makes the call? Because
No,
probably
no.
the road guy wanted to push
Yeah,
their road,
yeah.
and yeah.
And this is what happens in cabinet meetings.
Okay.
Okay, so because
Hmm.
the executive power lies in the cabinet.
Right.
So the cabinet, the minister takes on, and the president comes and sits there, or whatever, the prime minister, and then in the cabinet meeting, everybody will push their own ministry, right?
Yeah,
Obviously.
absolutely.
So then finally they'll say, this
Here
is the
based on
envelope.
so many other reasons,
Right.
but
Okay. Yeah.
yeah.
So this is the envelope that we can
Yeah.
take. We can't take more than $500 million next year because we, probably find it difficult to repay these
Hmm.
loans. So that is the decision of the prime minister to
Right.
manage this thing,
Hmm.
and then decide on the projects and so on. Now, once you pass that, then you have to find the final funding for those things. That is where the debt
That
office
just
starts.
comes right. Okay, got it.
Okay,
Got it.
and if you get a, so you write to all the lenders, even through sovereign bonds, there are many ways of
Right.
raising that. So that all that part, once the decision is made, what to do, what things to do, then to find the funding is where the debt managers
Comes in.
get involved.
Okay.
Yeah, but before that, I mean, if they, even before the funding, they have to look at the feasibility studies, whether there's a economic rate of return, what we
Okay.
the
It
financial.
has to be backed by
Yeah,
numbers
yeah,
to
yeah. So they have to
really prove.
understand, what are they trying to do, and then, you know, the study has to be done. I mean, they themselves don't do the feasibility studies, because the line ministry, will do that feasibility
Right.
study, and if they might themselves might find the funder,
Right.
you know, so together they will do something, but eventually it will come to the debt office for evaluation.
Evaluation. Understood. So this is interesting. So in the debt office operation, so what I gathered was for any project there has to be economic rate of return, and there are so many other matrices. So actually you can compare
Mm,
the projects, and debt office can evaluate if there's one loan, of course you have to take it, but if it's not, or whether to leave it based on the economic, to
mm,
where you are going to invest. But if you have multiple projects, that the debt office will come and basically evaluate which loans
mm.
brings you the most benefits, and probably we will go with that. So, in terms of the structure of the debt office, you mentioned about the front office, mid office, and the back office. How do you really? I know you have set it up the debt office in multiple countries, and you are engaging with some more. What is your experience? Has it really helped uh, to manage the debt? And also, is it come with or like other conditions, as you mentioned? There has to be a setup for feasibility studies to evaluate projects, or with maybe with governance structures, with executive presidency or parliament or cabinet making decisions. What is like the optimum way, with your experience, how it has worked well, and what are the other additional add-ons that we have to put to get
Yeah.
this going?
So even in both cases, if it's a quasi independent, you set up this front, middle, back office. But even in a departmental arrangement within the
Hmm.
Ministry of Finance, they still have the front office, middle office, back office,
Right.
but it's a bit scattered.
Right.
It's not together. Like, if you go to a building and if you say that's a DMO, they will look. The left room is front office. Middle room
Uh,
is middle office, and the right room is that.
back office,
But
yeah.
whereas this can be done in various departments and so on, and you bring them together. Um, in general, I think this thing has worked as long as you have the terms of reference defined, roles, responsibilities, and a work program. This arrangement works.
Okay.
Okay, but how it works, whether it works well or not under a quasi independent or this, the jury is still out.
Hmm.
It's not, because I mean, in cases where the governments can't set up independent office, because you have to pay higher salaries, you got to recruit the right people, you have to retain them, all that sort of thing. It's not, in low income countries, it's very difficult.
Right.
And then you get people who go on scholarships, favored by the minister.
Yeah.
Not all these kinds takes place, right? Because even scholarships you can make money, right? So
Yeah.
when you compare to your salary, so that part, it's a difficult part to
Hmm.
to judge, but it works. It works because you bring them together, in one area, and then you have the right people doing the right things. Nobody interferes with somebody else's work, and so on. So this yeah, this works.
Okay. So
And
in
I don't know whether it works well, but I mean,
right.
it depends on country to country,
Right.
but it works. Yeah.
Again, so from, is it right to assume, now you mentioned the challenges for low middle income countries like ours versus high income countries on setting up the debt office. You mentioned the governance issues that can come up. The
Mm.
minister will appoint if we try to make it like quasi independent or independent rather than like a department model. So in even in that context, how do you recommend, like, do you still recommend to go for a department sort of a setup, or if you are, because you have also engaged with trying to set up like a debt, not, I'm not sure whether you involved, but setting up a debt office, but how do you mitigate those challenges, or what would be the way in your experience on setting this up?
Yeah, I think if if the if the higher ups are stronger, and if they say they don't want an independent or quasi independent debt office, then uh, we can't do anything,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
But then there are other cases where they allow you to write the report and then object to it.
Right.
You know, they think they're pleased because the World Bank pays for you to come and do the report, right?
Right.
So they said, okay, give the guy, the World Bank guy, let him do it. At the end, we'll reject it.
Okay.
And this happens in many countries,
Right.
you know, because
Right.
because the thing is keeping a department within the Ministry of Finance uh, is the most appealing thing for the Minister of Finance,
Right.
because he can keep control of this,
Right.
you know. So therefore, they tend to they don't tend to reject belligerently in the initial stage, but they said let them write the report and we'll reject it after that.
Okay.
Okay, so a bit like my wife. So so here's the good news, and then here's the bad news. But that's what's going on. But having said that, um, there are countries now in Africa. I mean, you said low income country. I thought Sri Lanka is not a low income country. That's what they lost the concessional loans. Um, but perhaps now, if he revalues, then
Yeah,
perhaps it has gone
probably.
below
Yeah.
below that threshold. But countries like Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, they have got some sort of independent, sort of quasi-independent models. Not exactly either departmental or quasi-independent, but somewhere in between.
Right.
Yeah. So they do have. But I think that the strong point is that something that you raised, is that the first and foremost we have to keep the monetary policy different from the debt policy, different from the fiscal policy. Uh, that was the prerequisite in the UK case,
Mm-hmm.
because the Ministry of Finance was getting too much involved with the debt policy,
Okay.
and the central bank, Bank of England, got annoyed.
Right.
Okay, so basically, that's the starting point of this independent debt office.
Okay. Now I want to go a bit more detail on the debt management side and on these all definitions and some calculations in the last part of our podcast. So this does I'm not, there's no confusion on external debt and domestic debt, but what I have realized is different people refers it in different ways. Some people consider it as like the, I'm not sure if the right word is jurisdiction, like which legal setup this debt instrument has been issued, whether it's like the domestic legal structure or whether it's like the London law or like the New York law.
Hmm.
Based on that, they measure, okay, this is external debt, this is domestic debt. And there's another conversation whether based on the person who is holding the debt instrument, even if it's rupee debt, if I'm a foreigner,
Yes.
then it becomes like, okay, it's external debt because it's a foreigner
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
whom I have to
Yeah.
pay. And I think there's another confusion based on the currency, or like even because there are some
Yeah.
debt being issued in foreign currency but under local legal system.
Yeah.
How the IMF looks at it and
Yeah.
what is the right way to
Yeah.
look
I
at it?
mean, I am not sure what is the right answer, but because I follow most of the time the IMF definitions, it's between the holder. If the holder is a non-resident, then it becomes a
Yeah.
foreign debt.
Right.
Sorry, yeah, foreign debt. But if the holder is a domestic resident, then so it's the same definition as the balance of payments,
Right.
because the balance of payments is a transaction between a resident and a non-resident.
Non-resident.
Yeah. So it's the same. So that's the definition that we should take. but does not mean that the foreign currency doesn't come into play, but they come in different calculations.
Mm-hmm.
But by definition, if I hold even a rupee debt here because I'm a non-resident, it will be counted as external debt.
Debt.
Okay, so even if even a domestic person holding a domestic debt in US dollars, that will be a domestic
Big
debt.
debt.
Yeah. So it's a residency non-residency argument is the uh, preferred most preferred definition.
In terms of a debt strategy, moving forward, at least for Sri Lanka after restructuring, we really don't know the details, don't know about the haircuts, whether it can extend to a domestic debt restructuring. What is your experience? You have done debt restructurings at the London club and in some cases in the Paris club. Tell us, like, how is the experience? Are they like, because I thought if I give someone money and if that person says no, I can't pay it, I will not be very happy with it, of course. How does it happen at the London club? Are they cool about it? Are they having coffee and just
Okay.
negotiating, or is it like really like a war room that people are really fighting? And how does this happen? Just tell us.
Okay. So basically, there are different restructuring rules.
Mm-hmm.
So so let's take the methodologies, right? How you can restructure a debt. So you can reschedule the debt.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can't pay now, but in the future you'll get so much richer that you can pay. So there you take a rescheduling argument. In some cases, what you say is basically we have to write off some of the debt because no other, if you don't write off, then we couldn't bring it down to a sustainable level and so on. So, and then we have conversion schemes where, you can convert external debt to domestic debt and so on. So there are different sort of rules regarding the restructuring types. Okay. And then the second part is you do this under a forum, a governing forum. So if it's a bilateral debt, then what we call, we go to the Paris Club. But if you go to the Paris Club, then those people that you are negotiating there must be members of the Paris Club. Okay, so for example, China and India are not
Or
yet
not,
members.
yeah. In
Yeah,
our case, I
they
think
can be.
Japan
Yeah,
and
that
yeah.
means. So because how the, the Paris Club works is that everybody is treated equally. So everybody agrees on something. So not so that you don't get one lender being favored as opposed to another lender. So somebody gets the bigger, have to go through a bigger debt reduction than the other person. So this kind of equity kind of consideration is one of them. So that's what happens in the Paris Club. So it only deals with uh, members of the Paris Club. It's a bilateral debt. The London Club is dealing with commercial bank loans and syndicated loans. So commercial bank loans basically, have what we call the London Club, and where most of the time it's only rescheduling. I mean, they wouldn't take anything else, rescheduling. So that's what takes place. And of course, for the sovereign fund, sovereign bonds, then we have this, we have to negotiate because basically many people hold it, right? Many people hold, SL, Sri Lankan sovereign bonds. So you got to have it's a way of getting the haircut, right? Getting somebody to agree. So these all depends because there are laws about the collective action clauses, what can be applied and so on. So usually if you get 75% or 85% under the London or New York rule, I can't remember. Um, you can go up to, if 80% agreed and say, we'll write off 20%, the rest have to agree, because there are holdout creditors, right? They don't want any haircut, but generally they have to agree or something. So I know lesser about those things. But in the Paris Club, so I haven't decided to go to the Paris Club. You have to prepare a number of things. It's because the Paris Club is a 1 day event,
Okay.
basically. So one day they get into the room and during the and they don't allow anybody. Okay, so they can have IMF and the World Bank as observers, but they don't say anything unless they have been asked to say something. And the country normally, sits outside the room,
Right.
right? I mean, the ones that I've been to. But you have to prepare documents, right? So you have to have the IMF agreement, because otherwise, it's a compulsory thing. And then there are other clauses, what can be restructured and all this kind of stuff. And then they go through all that. And what they come out as collectively is called the agreed minute.
Right.
In that agreed minute, they will say, we are giving three options for you, right? The different countries have different options because originally they started with only one option. One, but now they have options, right? So either you have a debt reduction in the stock or in the flow, or the arrears reduction or something like that, right? Don't take it from me, but something like that.
Yeah.
So some countries would prefer arrears reduction or something, the arrears write off or whatever, stock write off, or the flow rearrangement of the flows, right? Payments. So I think they can actually decide, and so the whole community together as Paris Club, they said we can give one of the three. They can take on one of the three. So that's what happens, and then this agreed minute would say, then you have to renegotiate with individual credit lender.
Lenders.
Yeah, so that goes on, a process that goes on for another 1 or 2 years. Okay, because you have to fit them, and then you go and see them separately, each country and so on. So that's what happens there. In the case of the London club, in your rescheduling, there will be a leader, right? Basically, the kind of the person, the bank that has given the majority of the loans normally lead the team, and and then they will decide. And most of the time, there is not much you can do about debt reduction. They
Mhm.
don't write off, but what they do is they'll reschedule it for you. Just like when you go to the bank, you know, they won't say I will write it off, right? So basically, they'll say I'll give you another loan and some sort of extension, and then put a new interest rates, add a new interest rate on it. So this is what happens with that, and what comes out there also. IMF agreement is important for them. Also, they'll ask you, have you got the copy of the IMF agreement with this? So, and then, basically what comes out of that is called the head of terms, like the agreed minute, the heads of terms or something like that. So that underlines, we are to prepare to do this, and this, because different banks may do it in different ways of the rescheduling, but there's a common thread. Okay, so that's that, and then of course sovereign bonds is through, you have to really negotiate. So then that's why you have those two, Clifford Chance and as a legal advisor, and Lazard Telles,
Lazard has the
yeah, as
financial
as a
advisors.
financial advisor, because they've done it many times. They've done it in Zambia. They've done it in that I know in Nigeria, and so on. So you bring the experts together, and they have to negotiate with the investment bank and all the holders and all these kind of stuff. So this is what happens.
Okay. So just a question from a very common man's point of view. So you mentioned the country who is going through the debt restructuring pretty much kept outside the room, and it's the Paris Club members who decides, and even the IMF will be given like the observation status. They can't really get into the so isn't that unfair? Because I'm the person, I mean, if I'm the country who is facing this problem, and of course it may be because of my bad management, but now then you are deciding the Paris Club members. I'm just asking as a
Yeah,
common,
yeah.
because I may know the real challenges when I'm going to pay for it. Of course, politicians, they say so many things and they change and they come with people's mandate. I'm just trying to understand the logic, because visit, like, because if I am in the room, I will always try to try to negotiate as much as possible. Is there a logic in it?
No, because the thing is, the countries don't want to listen to any of these stories,
Right.
basically. So they want to listen to the stories when IMF does the program.
Understood. Okay.
So they take the IMF document and read it, and see the justifications and all that. So they don't have to go through another process
Right.
of torture,
Right.
of interviewing people. So the ones that I went, 1 or 2 Paris Club meetings, they were kept out,
Okay.
So and then they quickly decided, we give this, and this, and all that stuff.
Right.
Um, but I don't know whether it has changed now. whether it has, this kind of idea has changed. But they rely so much on the IMF document and what
Mm.
IMF tells them. So that is why, IMF might give just only 2.9 billion, whereas your Asian Development Bank might give 30 billion. But they are more powerful in that sense of people have credibility when the IMF says something,
Right.
you know, not any others,
Right.
usually. So for the credibility question, that's what the IMF does for you if you get into an agreement, basically.
We are coming to the last few questions of our podcast, Dr. Sangha. I want to understand, we have been speaking about on our informal conversations about these contingent liabilities. Could you kind of define what do you mean and what is the implication on this, on our debt sustainability and so on and so forth, just for, on a common man's point of view, because they also hear these terms nowadays, and I'm sure they will hear it more often when we get closer to the debt negotiations. What is it? And
Yeah. So basically, debt is a direct liability. Okay. So basically, what happens is if the government borrows, it has to repay. Now, here's the case where the government might be involved indirectly. That is to say that if you're, for sake, Sri Lankan Airlines or CPC wants to borrow a loan, but the lender is not prepared to give it to them directly unless there's a guarantee from the government.
right.
So all guaranteed loans, such loans, are what we call contingent liabilities. So it's contingent upon whether the person is able to pay. But if he's not able to pay, then the government has to pay.
Okay.
Okay, so it's kind of indirect liabilities. So something has to trigger this process. It's only when you can't pay or something, the government gets involved. Whereas the direct loans, you have to pay,
Anyway.
right? When it's due, you have to pay. So there are two sides of these contingent liabilities. One is the what we call the explicit liabilities, like
Mm-hmm.
like loan guarantees. Then the implicit, so that is governed by a legal contract. So when you give a guarantee letter to the lender, the government gives a guarantee letter to the lender that I will undertake to pay you. It's a legal contract. Whereas there is a moral side of this for the other implicit liabilities when there's a heavy rainfall and there are floods and something, and people get dispersed and all that. The government has a moral obligation to do something. So that's what we call the implicit liability. So pandemics, natural disasters, banking sector goes bust or something, so to save the depositors and so on. So that's the part that's called implicit liabilities. But for the debt manager, what is more important is the loan guarantees, because if the others have got fiscal risk, but they don't really get done by the debt manager. But the loan guarantees is because it's a loan. He has to get, the debt manager or debt staff has to get involved with that. So public debt definition does not include the guarantees.
Right.
It does not include because it's a contingent liability. But when the World Bank writes to you, because they write to get the total debt,
That
they can define it that way. I want you to give me the public debt plus
the
the
contingent liabilities.
the public guarantees,
Yeah.
guarantees, because that's what I wanted to publish in the International Global Development Finance or something they call every
Right.
year that they produce for all countries.
So from the work that we do at Advocata, I can confidently say that there's quite a lot of debt on these state-owned enterprises where the government has provided assurance or they have become the guarantee of that
Mm.
debt, so that we have a big challenge in that front
Yeah.
because
So I think basically nowadays, the if you see the DSA is done, this is now the contingent liabilities are taken into account
yeah.
while they're assessing the debt sustainability. Um, so it's becoming more prominent because some countries have 15% of GDP in contingent liabilities. Some countries are even more. But I think the IMF did a study, and on average, in 80 countries, they found something like 10 or 12% of GDP. I mean, some have low, some have high. So if you average it out,
because there's a fiscal risk in this, because suddenly a surprise comes along, springs, because the guy can't, the corporation can't pay, and then you got to get involved with that, And I think one or two other things, Dhananath, I want to say is that in the debt sustainability analysis, the people who should lead that debt and sustainability analysis are macroeconomists and fiscal
Hmm.
experts. And the debt manager should get involved in supplying the debt. So he's in the team, but he doesn't take the lead role.
Understood.
You know, so this is what happens in advanced countries, and this is the definition of the IMF and the World Bank, because you know they are very unhappy when they see debt managers are leading the team.
Right.
Okay, but there's a legacy for that,
Hmm.
because the legacy is that because many countries have gone through uh, debt relief mechanisms, and the governments think, okay, we'll give this to a debt manager because he knows how to do these things. So so because of the legacy, sometimes it's the continuing with debt managers, but actually that job has to be done by the macroeconomists, because we are basically measuring how much of debt we can hold in the macroeconomy.
Hmm.
So the ones that they should lead is the debt strategy. The debt strategy is formulated by having the objective of the debt manager is to borrow to fill the gap, financing gap in the budget, right? Uh, at the lowest cost and at a prudent level of risk, right? So that is the objective, and the strategy has to be, how do you do this? Is that so? That is the role that has to be played by the debt manager, and other people can take part. The macroeconomists. So they have a secondary role in that, while the debt manager leads. Whereas the DSA is the other way. The macroeconomist has to lead, and the debt manager has to support.
Okay. Got it. My final question, this is now, I think we discussed a lot on the debt restructuring, debt sustainability, about the independent debt office. Since you have worked in Africa quite a lot, and you mentioned the resources that they have diamonds, they have minerals, everything. But still, the question is, I mean, a lot of Sri Lankans also believe that these resources can make their people wealthier, having quality life.
Hmm.
But the countries that have a lot of resources, it seems quite the opposite.
Yes,
Why is that?
I think it's about management. Everything comes at the end. You know how you manage these things, right? Resources. So the only exception to this rule is Botswana, uh, because when they found the diamonds after just before independence, or I don't know, some time in the 60s or the 50s, um, they made sure that their people go and get trained in minerals engineering. So when DBS appeared, this international company started digging for diamonds, and they had a contract. The president that time, Seret Sekama, or Dr. Seret Sekama, said, as a part of this package, I want 15 people to go and study in Canada. So you see, these things, when you have good people, they think far ahead. Their vision, they have all the good qualities in a human being, right? So when you don't have that, then you look for a quick buck. Where can I make money? I am, personally, I become president, I become prime minister. Can I make money for my family? For 10 generations. So this is where it all falls flat. So if you look at all these countries, I mean, most of Africa has been lots of minerals, and that's why the Chinese are interested, right? Because I mean, Chinese are not interested in the jungles and looking after cheetahs or something there, right? So they are interested in getting old. So their contracts today are what we call collateralized debt. So they say, if you can't repay me this back, let me explore this land and let me use it under a leasehold that you have in Hambantota port for 99 years. So they're shrewd. Basically what they're saying is let's have a collateralized debt, that if you can't pay, I do this. And Africa is just signing off these things. So ultimately, in everything in life, if you can't manage it, and if you're not honest, virtuous and all these things, it gets abused, and what do you call, misused, and all those kinds of things. So that happens unfortunately, that seems to be a dominant, dominance. So that has shown dominance over good management. So,
Dr. Sangha, just a follow up question. So, when you say this hasn't been managed well, or like that is the reason, and how Botswana did it differently, so does it mean that the governments have to run these assets, or does it mean like because the other main complaint or the accusation is okay, you give it for the private companies, and also you make a buck, or like the politicians make a buck out of it.
mm.
So what is the balance? Or at the same time, if the government starts doing it, of course they will do this. They will also make I mean, not $1, maybe $5 out of it. So how do you basically, you know,
Yeah,
uh,
in the case they will set up their government corporation, and most countries, I mean here it might be different, but in Africa it's very difficult to find the technical companies locally, even in private sector.
mhm.
you know so you have to bring in, De Beers or somebody like that, art, Rio Zinc, something, uh, so there are companies, for these things, and then there are some Australian companies, I can't remember the names now. So you have to bring them, so they are the private sector, right? So, and then government has to negotiate, but they have to negotiate well so that it doesn't discourage the guy to leave the place, without signing an agreement. At the same time, not, dominating the government, basically taking the maximum out of it.
Mm.
So you have to, so that's a skill again, right? So if you talk to the World Bank and the Commonwealth Secretariat, they have advisors on these matters. So you find a nice balance between these two objectives. What the private person wants and what the government wants, and then when you get the money, that money is put into good use. So in the case of Botswana, from the diamond money, they do three things. One goes into the budget. One is a buffer stock. So in case when the diamond prices fall, so they can put this, as a safety net amount. And then they have what they call the Pula fund, because the local currency is called Pula. And then the Pula fund is for future generations and for their education and their welfare. So there's a proportion that goes, and it goes in almost according to plan. So, but all this to happen, you got to have good leadership. With bad leadership, none of these things will happen.
Dr. Sangha, tell us also a little bit about. I think this question could have asked earlier at the beginning of the podcast, but tell us a little bit about you as well and what made you to migrate and how is your experience in Sri Lanka and being a Sri Lankan and being on these high powered like all negotiations and earning all these credentials. Tell us a little bit about your story
I'm,
as well.
I don't think I'm very popular, but you make it sound as if I'm a grand old person. But anyway, so I was born in Ragama. I think the hospital is still there. And then my father took up a 5-year assignment in Singapore, because he was working for the external Ministry of External Affairs, and they gave him a post in this Singaporean High Commission. He worked 5 years in Singapore High Commissions, and my mother wanted to come because they were going to move him around the world a little bit. So my mother wanted to come back. She kind of felt, for our education and so on. So we came back. So by the time I came back, I was about 8 years old. I studied a bit in Jaffna, because I couldn't speak a word of Tamil. When I came back from Singapore, I could speak Chinese and English, but I couldn't speak Tamil. So then I learned some Tamil. Then when I was about 12 or 10 or 12, I came and joined St. Peter's College. And so that's my alma mater. So I was sixth standard. I don't know. I was about 58. Yeah, about 10 or 11 or something. And then I did all my studies there. I'm very loyal to my school. Uh, and then after A levels, I chose chemical engineering, and there was no chemical engineering here in Peradeniya University. That time they didn't have it. So the government was giving not scholarships, but they gave foreign exchange. Although the some foreign exchange, the exchange it was there was a control on foreign exchange. They were allowing certain amount for those who want to go and study and come back, right? So I went to England to study chemical engineering. So that took 4 years. So while working, because my course had two industrial period, training periods. So I worked for British Gas and British Steel, and I never liked working as a chemical engineer. So because I was basically a mathematician by nature, so I said, look, this doesn't suit me for another, because the future means 35, 40 years. So I chose to do statistics. So I went and did a postgraduate diploma in statistics at University of Manchester. And then I got a job in the milk marketing board in a dairy industry. And then after 3 years, I said, no, I want to continue more, right? So did a master's and PhD. But then slowly I moved to, statistical application in economics, called the subject called econometrics, and then did a PhD also in macroeconomics and econometrics. So the time that I finished, the Guyanese government was recruiting. They were going around the world to recruit the director for macroeconomics in the planning ministry because they couldn't find somebody. So I attended the interview and I was selected. So here I was. I think I was about 35 years old. Young as you and handsome as you, and so I went there and I didn't know how to run because I had 20 staff, all qualified staff. I didn't know how to manage them. Because I'm a guy who give me a computer, give me the sum, I will do it for you. So I found it very difficult, but the thing was, I learned a lot, but not man management so much because I was totally incapable of doing that. But what happened was when I went there, my boss, Mr. Clarence Blue, who was he was a chief planning officer, but is equivalent to a permanent secretary in the planning ministry. Um, he said, next week I'm coming, get prepared. So he gave him a article for is the usual starting off, right? The last article for you have to read.
Yeah.
So he came and said, Sangha, forget about all the book work that you did under a PhD and don't talk about growth. We have to stabilize first, right? So so that's why that's how I got into these sort of macroeconomic negotiations. So my starting point was the IMF meeting after 1 week after I joined as the director of macroeconomic in planning. I started negotiating and then sort of moved from one to the other, and I worked in the West Africa and so on under the UNDP and so on, and that continued. It's only maybe about 10 years I would have done macroeconomic work, and then I took a liking to debt management because that time Guyana had to do a debt restructuring under the Toronto terms, I think, or something. So I got involved with that. Um, and then I had a sort of a liking towards it, all that. So for the last 30 years, I've been doing public debt management.
Okay.
So one led to another. You normally improve if you're a sane person, right? Because if you don't damage yourself. So every time you do something, you accumulate the experience, right? So then I started doing short-term work and so on. Initially, I did long-term, resident advisor, and then short-term. So all in all, I have traveled to roughly 40 countries, including the three countries I'm doing now, which is Bahamas, Philippines, and Dubai. So all these put together, I would say it's 38 to 40 countries. I think it's very difficult to think when you are young, how to get this. But when you're older, when you've done all this, then it seems this must have come very naturally to you. Kind of everything. I have failed in some countries. I've gained in other countries. Um, so that's my. But what I do mostly is I'm an avid reader. So I on a Sunday morning when people go to church because I watch them from my window, I download an IMF article and read. So for me, church was that reading an IMF article. So you must have that thing to improve yourself. You have to read lots of articles, lots and lots of articles, and you have to read. And then, if you come to definitions, you have to read all the manuals and go into deep and read the manuals. So without these two, reading the articles and reading the manuals, you can never be a very good debt manager. I mean, a debt consultant, sorry. And then, one led to another. So basically, I did some advice, and then people found me, I could teach, I could explain things to people. So they gave me a dual role. Basically, every time they wrote me a contract, they said, Sangha, at least you have to do 5 days of training. Okay, so that's how I've developed all
Okay.
these skills.
That's how a chemical
Yeah,
engineer
but
became
I must say, Dhananath, that I'm emotionally attached to Sri Lanka. That's why I always look back and I say, what have I done for this country? Nothing. So I'm happy to give some time to people like Advocata.
Thank you, Dr. Sangha. So that's a story of a chemical engineer becoming a debt consultant, working and helping a lot of countries to come out of poverty. Thank you very much, Dr. Sangha, for joining
Thank you
us,
for having me.
our Reset Now podcast. So please subscribe, like, and share our content. And we look forward to see you in another Reset Now podcast. Thank you.
You can listen to this podcast on Anchor, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And remember to follow us on all our social media platforms for more exciting content. See you in the next episode.